Hello and welcome to a training presentation from Vigilant Fire Service Training. This lesson will be on building construction, specifically construction type review.
The extraordinary images coming in here at home. Firefighters tackling a potentially deadly blaze at a gas station. When take a look, part of the building collapsed, trapping a firefighter, setting off a frantic rescue. All unfolding as cameras were rolling. Here's ABC's Adrian Baker.
Oh my God! Oh my God!
It happened in one heart-stopping moment. This convenience store engulfed in flames. The front of the building collapses, crushing a firefighter at this Michigan gas station.
There's a fireman down! Get him out, get him out, get him out!
Cameras rolling as flames rage around him, burning dangerously close to gas pumps.
Careful, we've got this building pretty much fully involved.
The firefighter trapped under the debris, more than half a dozen first responders frantic, adrenaline pumping, lifting that metal frame, desperately trying to pull him out, some with their bare hands, another dousing flames with a fire hose.
I lost caller with a passerby and advised it looks like there's still people in the building.
Witnesses calling for help, shocked by what's unfolding in front of them. Just 2.5 minutes later. Applause as the man is pulled out, amazingly seen up and walking around.
He's standing, so okay, thank God.
That firefighter pulled from the flames, treated for second-degree burns and bruising. A second firefighter was treated for smoke inhalation. Both of them released from the hospital. That department thankful tonight.
As we can see from the video, understanding the relationship between building construction and firefighting is critical to the firefighter's safety. Had the firefighter in the video understood the hazards associated with the type of building construction he was operating at, the outcome could have been avoided in general. Firefighters need to understand building construction based on 4 primary categories. They are the designed occupancy, construction methods and materials used, the associated hazards, and the fire characteristics based on how the fire will affect certain types of building construction. The objectives for today's lesson. Following this lesson, the firefighter will be able to list the 5 types of building construction according to Nfpa 220. Define the typical occupancy of each construction type. Identify typical building materials of each construction type. Recognize hazards associated with each construction type. Let's start with occupancy. Every building begins as a design. The design is based on 3 basic considerations. Considerations are primary occupancy, in other words, who's going to be using the building. Designed loads, what is the building going to be used for and what's going to be in it. And the available building materials, what materials are available for that construction. Residential occupancy includes 1- and 2-family homes, as well as multi-family dwellings, including apartment buildings and high-rise apartments. Commercial occupancies include stores, restaurants, and typically places or settings in which a product is bought, sold, or commerce takes place. The industrial setting is typically known as manufacturing, or an occupancy in which something is made, built, or modified. And our special occupancies being those special consideration buildings. This would be our schools, our nursing homes, hospitals, and even some governmental buildings, such as post offices and Social Security buildings. Our mixed occupancy means that we have a mix of some form of secondary occupancy along with residential occupancy. We often call these taxpayers, or buildings that have a commercial occupancy on the first or lower levels with residential occupancy on the upper floors. Building design takes two main loads into account: dead loads and live loads. Dead loads are the weight of the structure itself, the weight of its walls, its roof, its ceiling. The weight of the building itself is considered a dead load. Dead loads are static forces that are relatively constant for an extended period of time. These loads remain static or remain the same over a period of time. Live loads, on the other hand, a live load is a load that has been added to the building. Live loads is the weight of people or goods in the building itself. Live loads are usually variable and moving loads. These change over time. These can change significantly between seasons and can change dynamically depending on how much consideration has been taken into place of the impact, momentum, vibration, slash, so on and so forth of the building's contents. Building materials throughout history and well into the 20th century, building materials were selected by region or by area. In other words, certain woods were used in certain areas dependent on their availability. This is much like saying maple was used predominantly in the north while oak was used predominantly in the south. Building materials until the 1950s or so pretty much were based upon region. Today's modern era, we have a variety of building materials, which can be shipped by train, truck, so on and so forth. In our modern area of building construction, we insert Nfpa. The National Fire Protection Association, their standard 220, was rewritten in 1979. And what the rewrite basically did was it encompassed the primary occupancy with the design loads to equal the material that the building will be made out of. So NFPA 220, when it was rewritten in 1979, broke building construction into 5 primary types. Those 5 primary types were based on the building's ability to withstand itself or withstand structural integrity during a fire. Type 1 was considered fire resistive. Type 2, much like Type 1, considered non-combustible. Type 3 was ordinary construction. Type 4, wooden construction but heavy timber. And Type 5, our standard wood frame construction. Type 1 construction, fire resistive construction. Fire resistive construction structural members are made of non or limited combustion materials. Occupancy in Type 1 construction is primarily commercial. However, we do find industrial, residential, specialized, and mixed occupancy in these building construction types. The materials used in Type 1 building construction include concrete, masonry, and block. Hazards that are associated with these types of buildings are extremely hot fires, wind-driven conditions because these buildings tend to be built at higher levels above grade than any other construction type. We are also bound by limited access to these buildings. These buildings of all construction types have the lowest potential for collapse. Type 2 construction, non-combustible construction. Like Type 1, these structural members are made of materials that will not add to the spread of a fire. However, they do not meet the strict standards of Type 1 materials. Type 2 construction occupancy typically is commercial, industrial, or special. The materials that go into this building type are metals, rubber, foams, and masonry block. Hazards associated with type 2 construction are lightweight truss, areas for the fire to hide, special types of occupancy, and collapse. Type 2 construction has the highest potential of collapse of any building construction type. Type 3 construction, ordinary construction. These buildings have exterior structural support that are constructed from non-combustible materials, such as brick or block. However, internal components, such as floor members and roof structure, may be made from combustible materials. Those combustible materials include common materials like wood. Type 3 construction occupancies is also known as Main Street USA. These are typically commercial, industrial, with some residential. And this is the highest category for our mixed occupancies. Type 3 construction materials include brick, wood, and cast iron. In this form of construction, we can see on this building the cast iron on the front of the building, represented by the S's over the main doorway. These S's are tied to cast iron rods that transfer between the floor space from one wall to another, holding the external walls together as a joiner. The outside of this building is made of brick up to 18 inches thick. However, the internal components and floor of this building is made out of wood. The joint between the wood floor and the brick wall doesn't go through to the exterior of the building. These rods are used to keep the exterior wall of the building in line with the opposing exterior wall, which in this case would be found on the D side. Hazards include void spaces, balloon framing, and multiple renovations in these buildings. These buildings are well known for hard to locate fires and fast traveling fires from one location to another. This happens between the spaces in the walls and spaces in the floor. Typically, these buildings have joining cocklofts that allow fire in one building to travel to its adjoining building that shares the same roof. These buildings are also much older than our typical Type 5 construction buildings. That means these buildings have been around for a long time and gone through many owners. From one owner to another, typically buildings are being renovated and changed for the new occupancy. This creates a maze of renovations inside most of these buildings. These buildings, as far as collapse potential, collapse is delayed in these buildings because they are well built. However, when these buildings collapse, it is catastrophic. We typically talk about collapse zones being 1.5 times the height of the building. When we're talking about Type 3 building construction, we say 2 times the height of the building, because falling brick, once it hits the street, has an everlasting energy that creates projectiles much further distances away than your typical building collapse. Type 4 construction, heavy timber construction. These buildings are composed of large structural beams that make up the framework and support of the building. These members are typically wood beams larger than 8 inches in dimension. However, they are considered fire resistant due to their ability to withstand fire exposure of 2 hours or more. Type 4 construction occupancy is typically industrial. Old mills were built using Type 4 construction. They look a lot like Type 3 construction, but where they vary is the fact that the interiors of these buildings is a large wooden framework, and the outside brick actually proves itself to be more of a facade or an enclosure. There's also special occupancies that are Type 4 construction. These special occupancies include churches, barns, bowling alleys, any building that requires a large open area can be considered Type 4 building construction, or should be thought of as possibly being type 4 building construction. We also find many old world residences, old world construction that are made from type 4 building construction, where the interior framework of these buildings, like this salt box pictured, is made from post and beam construction. Materials in this type of construction is obviously wood. They are large timbers, large dimensional lumber, and more modern type 4 building construction is seeing much more of the manufactured lumber, the laminated beams. These beams, though, can be 12 by 12 inches in dimension. Type 4 construction hazards include large open areas, increased fire loads in these buildings, and these buildings are extremely difficult to soften. These buildings will collapse after hours of uncontrolled fire exposure. However, the threat of collapse must never be taken lightly. Just because these buildings take a long time to collapse doesn't mean that we don't approach them with the same risk management tactics of any defensive fire. Type 5 construction, wood frame construction. Typical 1 and 2 family home construction. These buildings are framed using both dimensional and engineered lumber. The size of these structural members are significantly smaller than that of the type 4 heavy timber construction. Occupancies are any and all types of occupancies. As modern construction techniques are perfected and engineered lumber increases, we can have buildings such as large apartments to large hotels. These buildings mimic themselves as other building construction types, such as type 3 or even type 1. However, the internal components of this building are type 5 wood frame buildings. Type 5 building construction is the most common residential building type in the United States. Materials obviously include dimensional lumber, wood sheeting, wooden trusses, and manufactured lumber. Hazards of this construction type is the lightweight construction materials. Structural integrity is almost absent under fire loads. We have increased fire loads in these buildings. People put more and more stuff in their homes, and more of the stuff going into their homes these days is petrol or oil based. There are large void spaces in these buildings. Fire can transfer from one area to another with rapid spread, and collapse of these buildings is common. In fact, type 5 construction is the second most common type of building construction to experience structural failure or collapse during a fire. So in summary, what we want to understand the occupancy, and that includes what is the life hazard in that occupancy and what is the fire load of that occupancy. We also want to understand the materials that are involved in each building construction type. How resistant are they to fire, and how much integrity do they provide to the structure when the building is involved with a fire? And obviously the hazard, what can we lose after interacting with these buildings, and how could we lose? We could lose through rapid fire travel, but most often we're worried or concerned about collapse of these structures. When we're talking about collapse of these structures, we can use this mnemonic to remember the order in which buildings collapse. No water on the fire. No, meaning non-combustible or type 2 construction, is typically the first buildings to collapse or have the highest potential of collapse. Water, the W being wood frame or type 5, would be second in line. As construction techniques grow and technology increases and the building materials get lighter and lighter, these buildings are more susceptible to collapse under conditions of fire. On stands for the ordinary or the type 3 building, the ordinary building that takes a while to collapse, but when it does it in dramatic fashion. T, timber frame, type 5 construction. Typically, hours of fire exposure are required for these buildings to collapse. However, every year, these building construction types kill firefighters in defensive operations during collapse. And last but not least, the F in fire for fire resistive or type 1 building construction. No type 1 building has collapsed under normal fire load. So the assignment for this lesson is a little bit different. You've been given a job performance requirement instead of a quiz. For this, you're going to fill out your name and the date, follow the description. So you're going to be taking this out in the street, out into your first due areas, out into your fire district. And what you're going to do is for each type of building construction that we just talked about, you're going to give the address or the name of the building, the materials that the building is made out of, firefighting hazards that we could run into fighting this type of a building, and what fire behavior characteristics you could expect in each one of these buildings. Where's the fire going to travel to? How would the fire travel? Is there a heavy fire load? Is there a light fire load? So on and so forth. You're going to go ahead and do that for each one of these buildings. Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, Type 4, and Type 5. Now, most districts will have a variety of each type of these building constructions. However, Type 1 may be hard to find if you're in a rural area. Type 1 building construction is typically more centralized to urban and suburban environments. So what we want you to do is we want you to observe the building construction in your area. Determine the construction type. What type of construction is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5? Describe the primary materials. Is it steel? Is it wood? Block? We also want you to define the primary occupancy. What is the building? Is it a residence? Is it a commercial building? Is it industrial? And identify the potential hazards. Does this building have drop ceilings? Known voids? Is it a balloon frame construction building? What are the hazards that we would encounter if this building were on fire? And that's going to conclude this lesson on building construction types. Look for future lessons regarding each one of these as we'll dive deeper into Type 1, Type 2, Type 3, Type 4, and Type 5. Until the next time, remember, tomorrow's victories are a result of today's training. Stay safe.